There is a trap. It is the trap of thin hereditarianism. By thin hereditarianism, I mean focusing too narrowly on IQ differences between races. Now, good news, race realism is being accepted on the internet much quicker than I ever predicted it would. It's a palpably different environment than it was in 2012. Not only are there more full-on race realists, but in general, people do not flip out in the way they used to. But what white nationalists should remember is that this race and IQ stuff was always a defensive argument. It was part of the argument saying to stop attacking whites for being however successful they are, because there are these gaps in life outcomes you see. Gaps in wealth, gaps in health, gaps in income, gaps in going to prison. Why are there these gaps? Evolution explains it, and the debate at heart is about evolution. But there's a lot more to it than these little numbers here. If you're still on the race denial track or the IQ denial track, well, then linked in the description of every video that I have here is the alt-hype race and IQ reader, and that's thin hereditarianism right there. But this video is thick hereditarianism. It first of all describes that the cognitive differences between the races are much more than the nominal IQ gaps you normally see. The races have a whole basket of traits, and someone having an exceptional IQ for his race is still going to be more like the other people of his race across the whole spectrum of behavior, and that all these traits regress towards the mean intergenerationally, and then of course there is the genetic mesh. So the first thing to understand is that racial differences in cognitive traits are much larger than the nominal IQ scores. If you were to look at East Asians and just full-scale IQ scores, you would say that East Asians born and raised in the United States have IQs of between 103 and 106, depending on the test. East Asians born and raised in Japan or Korea are somewhere between 105 and 108, and this is evidence of some environmental impact from living in East Asian countries. Or we can talk about that dead horse, the black-white IQ gap. You'll often hear about the 15-point black-white IQ gap, or better yet, people get really hung up about whether the IQ gap has narrowed. When you break down the subtests, you'll find much larger differences. For example, comparing blacks and whites who have full-scale IQs of 89, you can look at the kind of tests that blacks, for example, do better on. For example, digit span, which is just remembering a series of numbers forward and backwards. Information, arithmetic, which is non-algebraic math. Coding, which is actually more like decoding. They'll give you some shapes assigned to letters, and then they'll give you a series of shapes, and you have to decode the words that the shapes spell out, right? And blacks tend to do this more quickly than whites when the full-scale IQ is the same. So it's one of the things that blacks do relatively better on. Things that whites do relatively better on would be object assembly, which is where they give you some shapes and tell you to assemble the shapes into a silhouetted object. Mazes, sentence comprehension. Those are pretty self-explanatory. Block design is like object assembly, except you have physical blocks that are painted differently on each side, and you have to recreate another painted shape. The best research on this is done on the black-white gaps, but I also found one study that broke down the subtests on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale between Europeans and East Asians, and it shows big differences in patterns of intelligence. For example, the East Asian advantage is highest in block design and arithmetic and picture completion. Europeans did better on sentence comprehension, and this is probably not a cultural thing, as these gaps in the verbal category, right, which comprehension, sentence comprehension is going to be one subset, but in the verbal category, Europeans tend to do better on the SAT, even with third, fourth, fifth generation East Asians. It doesn't go away over time. It's not just an artifact of learning a new language. If you wanted to make an IQ test that Europeans would beat East Asians on, you would pick sentence comprehension, coding, mazes, and information. So yes, East Asians score on average 3 to 8 points higher than Europeans on full-scale IQ. But embedded in that are things where Europeans score the equivalent of about 14 points higher, and East Asians score the equivalent of about 16 points higher. This is also true with Amerindians. By cognitive profile, Amerindians are probably just less intelligent East Asians. They have a similar profile, but with lower scores all across the board, which isn't too surprising given that East Asians evolved from Siberian peoples. Now, as usual, the easiest data to find on this is always with the black-white gaps. But there is data that we can look at with item difficulty. In a study of South African engineering students, it was found that just using the top half most difficult questions on the IQ tests raises the IQ gap 3.28 points. And these are with engineering students. These are not random people plucked out of the population. These are not elementary school students. These are engineering students at universities. So using the top quarter of difficulty on the IQ test, that raises the gap 6.46 points. And using the top 8.3% most difficult questions raises the black-white gap by 11.62 points. So if you took the IQ tests that whites do relatively better on, that is the half of the IQ test that whites with the same overall IQs as blacks will do better on, for example, object assembly, sentence comprehension, things we talked about before, and you just picked the toughest 8.3% of questions, you'd probably have a black-white gap of around 30 points instead of 15. And this actually ties in a little bit to regression towards the mean. Now, based on the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth data from 1979 and replicated in 1997, we know that the next generation regresses about halfway from their parents to the family mean IQ. Okay, and this is just a brute fact. And of course, the average family mean IQ for whites is 100, for blacks 85, for Hispanics around 90-ish. Also, given that blacks, Hispanics, and whites have the same average incomes at given average IQ levels, and the same average socioeconomic status, so long as you're comparing big enough groups, socioeconomic status and income will function as a proxy for IQ within the United States comparing groups. And so we can look at SAT scores by race and socioeconomic status, and we can see that white SAT takers, when their parents have similar IQs, score higher on the SAT. So, and we know this because parental education and income are direct proxies for IQ when comparing racial groups to each other. Of course, SAT test takers are not a random sample, so we're looking through a glass darkly here, but this does appear to be an expression of regression towards the mean. Now, why does it regress halfway? Why is it that when a black couple with a mid IQ of 100, when they have a kid, the best predictor for their offspring's IQ is going to be 92.5? Why is that? Why is it halfway? Why is it 50%? That seems awfully convenient. Well, I can tell you, but it requires... I can tell you, but there's a lot of priors to it. Here's why. It's because the racial IQ gaps match the general heritability of IQ, and the general heritability of IQ in humans is about 50% additive genetic, 30% non-additive genetic, and 20% environmental. And the effects of non-additive genetics and environmental effects, they get wiped out each generation. Okay, so each generation, it's only the additive effects that are passed on. Environment isn't really passed on because shared environment doesn't really matter. Okay, unshared environment matters, but shared environment doesn't really matter, so that doesn't get passed on. Your parental environment doesn't really matter. And the non-additive genetic effects don't get passed on. So only the 50% of variance in IQ, which is determined by additive genetic effects, gets passed on. Okay, and this is also the same, and it's the same across racial groups as well. That's why it's going to go back 50% to the racial mean. So that's why. For those who just sort of want to know, that's why. Now, obviously, I just said a bunch of things that require a lot of evidence. There's a lot of backstory to, so variance in IQ in the United States is 50% a function of additive genetics, 30% non-additive, 20% environmental. How do you know these things? Okay, well, I could argue that, but that would take about 3 hours to argue. I'm just saying, for people who want to know that's why this happens, that's why this happens. Okay, but So it's sort of weird. So to tell you why this happens, I have to sort of assert some things that require roughly 3 hours to argue. Okay. So what this means in practice is that for full-scale IQ, not the specific things that we were looking at before, but the full scale, the full test IQ, two black parents with an IQ of 100 will have an offspring who has an average IQ of 92.5. But I did some calculations back for if you just use the white half of the IQ questions, and that is, object assembly, sentence comprehension, things like that. So if you just use those kinds of questions that whites do better on, and use the top 25% most difficult questions, I called this white favored IQ. If you did this, then black mid-parents with a white favored IQ of 100 would have an offspring with a white favored IQ of 86.14 on average. Black parents with a white favored IQ of 130 would have an offspring with a white favored IQ of 101.12 on average. But of course, the number of black people who would actually have a white favored IQ of 130 or above is going to be basically 0. Okay. And so what this means is that, yes, there is a lot of overlap when you look at full-scale IQ scores. But if you break down these tests by specific cognitive functions, you will find certain cognitive traits with which there's virtually no overlap. At least not overlap that is sustained into the next generation. We could also do this with Asians. Asians probably do better on more difficult questions. So if you took the top 8.3% most difficult questions and picked the Asian favored half of the IQ test, you could probably get Asians scoring 20 points higher just on that slice. Maybe they would only score 15 points higher because okay, so it'd be about 5 points just from using the Asian favored questions, and Asians just as a brute fact score about 5 points higher than Europeans on IQ tests. So you're at 10 points there. So the next question is, what would be the effect of item difficulty? I don't think it would be as big as the black-white difference, but I think Asians would do better on the more difficult questions. So yeah, probably about 15 points actually, now that I think about it. So far, I've just been dealing purely with IQ. I've been thinking totally inside the IQ box. But there are other traits besides IQ, and this gets into something I call trait mountain. It's actually another form of regression to the mean, but in order to avoid confusion, I'm calling it trait mountain. I think this is a good way to sort of describe it to the public. Basically, even when you control for IQ between racial groups, the other traits are not going to be the same. For example, when IQ is controlled for, there are still racial gaps in criminality, sure, but more importantly, all the other traits that criminality is associated with. For example, blacks commit about 9 times as many homicides per capita as whites, which is bad, okay? But the truth is, homicide's not a very big issue, so it's not really important in and of itself. It's the other character traits that criminality represents, which are going to be higher in the whole population, that produces a higher number of outright killers. Okay, so if you produce 9 times as many killers per capita, you're probably going to produce 9 times as many assholes in other ways, basically. So a member who is exceptional in one trait for his race is going to be slightly less exceptional in others. For example, a white person with an IQ of 100 is going to be expected to be about the same as white people on all the other traits, on average. Every person's an individual. There's undulations in all individuals, okay? But the expected values is going to be a flat line. But a black person with an IQ of 100 will, across all the other traits, be intermediate on them to varying degrees. And this creates a mountain peak, right? Which is why I call it trait mountain. It varies from item to item, but the heritability of political views in the United States is about 40% if it's indexed, if it's treated as an index. The heritabilities of single items are lower than the heritability of an overall index score. Now, when looking at group differences, we have specific genes from Way and Lieberman in 2010, and they explain a lot about group variation in individualism and collectivism, and in social sensitivity. And these correlations are 0.65 and 0.67, respectively. I also plotted some of Chiao and Blazinski's data against Pew's survey data on support for various kinds of free speech by country and found significant correlations between them. And remember, these are just correlations with individual genes. These are just single genes. And these genes are, of course, within group validated, which is important because if you didn't validate effects within groups, you could just say that the genes that cause darker skin cause lower IQ because you'd have a correlation there. And obviously you can't do that. You have to validate these genes as being predictive within groups before you can start to use them to explain differences between groups. But the thing to note is that the correlation found in Lieberman and Way is higher than the general heritability of political views within the United States on that single gene. Now, I think that's kind of interesting. So with all this talk of environment, some people imagine that genes leave the picture. When you say, oh, it's 40% heritable, 60% is down to environment, okay, so that's environment. Genes don't have any impact there. Well, environment, in terms of how social scientists look at it, environment is divided into two pieces called shared and unshared. But it's easier to just describe it as chosen versus unchosen. Chosen environment would just be, for example, what you as an adult choose to eat, presuming that money isn't responsible for the variation in what you choose to eat, which it usually isn't. Unchosen environment would be your family, or all the effects of that. For example, what school you go to as a little kid. Okay, those are unchosen environmental effects. Now, there are twin studies showing that the heritability of independent reading, for example, is about 55%. Okay, and that the heritability of exercise is about 63% in males and 32% in females, and the heritability of diet is about 32%. That wasn't broken down by gender, though. So take Asians voting Democrat overwhelmingly. Now, part of that is going to be just simple, direct genetic differences between Asians and Europeans. I don't think we can know how much of an effect simple, direct genetic differences have. But we know that for individuals within the United States, based on twin studies, genetics accounts for about 40% of variation in political views. But when comparing races, well, one thing to take into consideration is how big these racial differences are compared to kinship coefficients. An FST value in practice is an inverse kinship coefficient. Henry Harpending's paper, he actually explained why FST is in effect a kinship coefficient divided by 2. And since the FST distance between Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans is about 0.166, that can be modeled as anti-kinship. So Europeans and Africans have an anti-kinship of negative 0.332. Or if you want to set the European-African genetic similarity, if you want to set that to 0, then you'll set that to 0, and then the kinship that you have with a random European is 0.332. That may be sort of a nicer way to put it, to say that the European-African kinship is 0, and therefore your kinship with another random European is 0.332. As opposed to saying your kinship with a random European is 0, and therefore your kinship with an African is negative 0.332. And also, you can also model the gender differences on the Y chromosome as an FST distance and compare that to racial differences. So when looking at any trait, be it criminality, intelligence, political views, there's going to be a genetic mesh. And basically every human psychological trait has some genetic component to variation in it. And this was a point made by Thomas Bouchard in 2004, where he said, quote, "Any dispassionate reading of the evidence leads to the inescapable conclusion that genetic factors play a substantial role in the origins of individual differences with respect to all psychological traits, both normal and abnormal," close quote. And every psychological trait that has been studied has some genetic component to it, but it goes further. So what influences a trait, any trait? Let's think about political views. So you got genes, you got family, you got environment, right, chosen and unchosen, okay? You got society, your peers, and you have some sort of doctrine, a religion, ideology, or an anti-doctrine like anarchism. So you can think of it like all these factors have arrows of different sizes pointing out at you from the screen, influencing you. The arrows are of different sizes for each factor, but genes, of course, are almost always going to be the biggest of all these things. Sometimes genes are bigger than all the other arrows combined, pointing at you coming off the screen. For politics, the arrows have different sizes, but then with intelligence, the arrows will change in different sizes. Genes is going to be a lot bigger. Then with aggression, they change again. The arrow for genes gets smaller, the other arrows get bigger. But let's go back down to the second dimension. We know that genes will affect the chosen environment that you live in, that we talked about before. Independent reading being about 55% a function of genetics, for example. But next, we can look at the family. Now, compared to a background kinship of 0, your parents and siblings have a kinship of 50% with you. A little bit more because of assortative mating, but it's going to be close to 50%. But if you consider that your family is also of your own race and take into account this sort of population kinship or racial kinship, sound a little bit white nationalist here, then the kinship coefficient is going to be between 0.7 and 0.8, depending on what other racial groups you're comparing to. So your peer group, of course, is going to impact your political beliefs, but your peer group is, again, usually people of your own race. There's some genetic similarity there. But beyond that, the kind of people in your peer group tend to have similar personality traits. So to the extent that your personality traits are a function of your genetics, your peer group is chosen to match a phenotype produced by your genes. You're not necessarily picking, similar genes to those personality traits, but you're picking those personality traits reflective of your genes. So it's a bit indirect, but ultimately your genes influences your peer group in those two ways. Of course, family, which shares a large amount of your genetics, is also going to influence your peer group. So family also influences your unchosen environment as well. So even there's an indirect genetic effect on your quote-unquote unchosen environment. Because it's an unchosen environment created mostly by your parents, but your parents share a whole lot of your genes. So your unchosen environment is going to be a function of your genetics, given that your parents have half of them. You also have this other thing over here. It's called society. And the society you live in determines the choices you have for chosen environment. Right? Because you're choosing what to do. If your society is super poor, well, then you're not going to have a whole lot of time for independent reading and self-education. And it will influence your family, and it will influence the doctrine that you believe. Of course, the family will also influence the doctrine that you believe in. But your genes will be somewhat reflective of your society, even if you live in a multiracial state. Because sure, there are lots of blacks and Hispanics in the United States, but most white people live segregated from other races. In fact, using neighborhood-level segregation indexes, the U.S. is more racially segregated today than it was in the 1980s. Of course, if you use city-level segregation indexes, you would think that the U.S. is getting less segregated, but that's silly because if you use the highest level index, which is the non-white population of the United States, you would say the U.S. is getting more integrated every year because it's getting more non-white every year. But of course, that's silly. So if you're going to measure segregation, you have to measure down low to a low enough resolution that you can actually sort of proxy how much interpersonal contact is happening. But anyway, that's another topic for another time. If you're white, the relevant society for you is 90+% other whites. And so your society, even if you're in the United States, is going to be a function of people who are more genetically similar to you than they are to the rest of humanity. If you're white, you're going to be interacting with white people. You're going to be watching white people on shows, okay, who act a lot differently than black people. And of course, peers probably also influence the doctrine that you have. And so it's all massively interconnected. The society you live in is produced by genetically similar people, and your chosen environment is largely a function of your genetics. About half, depending on your genes, and depending on the thing we're talking about. Your chosen environment influenced by this society thing. Your family is of your genetics, taking into account both familial and racial kinship. Everything else has a tie to your genetics. The interconnectedness between these factors that themselves are somewhat a function of your genetics. This all on top of the direct effect of your own genome, just the simple effect of genetics itself on you, okay? And so the results are that genes, directly or indirectly, they're in everything, okay? They're meshed with everything. And this is why I call it the genetic mesh. And so when we look at racial differences in political views, saying that these differences are totally a result of genetics is not so absurd, depending on how you look at it. Because it's not individuals that are out there in the world, it's these genetic meshes, and each individual is enmeshed in all of these collective factors. Yes, the views of groups, or the views of various genetic meshes, do change over time in response to changing technology or to some calamity or some sort of war. And so then we should say that the political tendencies of the mesh are environmentally influenced, while the political views of the individual, not so much, once we take into consideration indirect genetic influences. Ideological change that occurs over time in people, but in these genetic meshes, in these genotypic societies, these gene environmental meshes, okay, where the genes are the environment and the environment is the genes. So it's not just a 15-point IQ gap or a 6-point IQ gap. Pop open the lid and the differences are much more profound. In addition, it all regresses to the mean. Each exceptional individual on average regresses halfway back to the racial mean for the overall IQ, but also the subtest scores. The result being that true cognitive differences between the races are much bigger than the nominal full-scale results would indicate. And while there are zones of overlap, these zones are mostly temporary, and each family line will regress back in a generation. When these tests are broken down into specific cognitive domains, the intergenerational, or the overlap that is sustained between generations, between two races, can be close to zero. But that's just for IQ. When you basket in other traits, odds are that two people of different races with even the same full-scale IQ, for whatever that's even worth, given the differences in cognitive profile, they're still going to differ in just about every other personality measure, which is why high IQ blacks still act like white people. There's a whole suite of behaviors, and while egalitarians love to point out how much overlap there is in any one trait, saying there's 25% overlap in IQ, 35% overlap for political views, 10% overlap for criminality, well, that's just each trait in isolation. The whole package similarity is going to be much less, and even then it would only last for a single generation. In politics, in government, the racial groups will block up. So even whites, they're starting to block up as the old conditioning is starting to wear off. And this stuff is going to get increasingly important as more people accept what I call thin hereditarianism, where they basically just look at IQ, and see that aside from the black-white difference, the gaps aren't too big. So maybe, have some better screens on immigration and it'll all work fine. That's sort of the conclusion that a lot of people will go to if they're just looking at these IQ stuff in like a very thin way. I'm saying no, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, and these people form into different genetic meshes. The racial groups, they're not necessarily hostile, but democracy plus a whole lot of anti-white historical myths, they're going to create the conditions for hostility, plus economic inequality combined with an explanation that it's because of oppression. This is going to create a lot of hostility. This is not going to end well. Now, in my experience, I've actually been able to use these arguments, these thick hereditarian arguments, before convincing another person of thin hereditarianism. And it actually helps to convince them of sort of the thin hereditarian arguments. I discovered that you could make more advanced arguments without sort of establishing the foundations, and that those advanced arguments actually help to persuade people about the simpler, more foundational arguments. And so it changed the way I thought about pushing this stuff. At first I was sort of afraid to say more advanced things before saying simple things, but then I thought, well, actually, the advanced things, it's basically like, here's where this leads, here's where the simple stuff leads, here's what we can say about the world in a very comprehensive and kind of compelling way if you accept the simple things. And so it's kind of like a preview of where you're going to go from the more foundational thin hereditarian stuff. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because while explaining full-scale IQ differences with environmental just-so stories is, it's intuitively doable, when they start having to explain specific subtest gaps, like, what are the environmental explanations for blacks being better at coding, digit span, and simple math than they are at mazes or object assembly? I mean, you could probably come up with something, or regression to the mean, right? The hereditarians have an instant answer involving the components of heritability for regression to the mean, but the environmentalists, why does it regress halfway? Well, I can tell you why it regresses halfway, because 50% additive genetics for the racial gaps, 30% non-additive, 20% environmental. That's why it regresses halfway. I can tell you right now, right? And all the other streams of data, go into that thing. But of course, go into that explanation, which would predict regression to the mean to the degree that we see. But the environmentalists, well, they're going to have to jerry-rig something real quick to explain why this happens to the degree it happens. So I guess using these sort of more advanced arguments can actually kind of help to explain, to justify the simpler arguments, because you're basically saying, here's where this goes. And oh boy, where this goes isn't that awfully compelling. So I wanted to just make this video to talk about more profound racial differences, because I see a big counter to race realism and a big counter to white nationalism sort of in the box is that the differences between racial groups in personality and psychology are not that big. And I'm here to say, A, they are that big, and B, there are collective effects. Humans sort of gravitate to genetic societal meshes of their own types, and it's probably a genetically determined thing that they gravitate towards. So even when we talk about the environment, that there's these racial differences, but a big portion of that is environment. Well, that environment is caused by the kind of genetic mesh that they're in with other people of their own race that they gravitate to. Chimpanzees don't know language, but that's an environmental effect. If you raise a chimpanzee with humans, it'll learn some language. But if you raise a chimpanzee with other chimpanzees, it doesn't learn a language. It's like, well, sure, but and so therefore chimpanzees not knowing how to sign, that's environmental. That's an environmental disadvantage. But is it really? I mean, the chimpanzee environment, is not the chimpanzee environment a function of its genetics, right? So so it's important not to totally separate genes from environment. And it's also important to make a more robust sort of argument, a more robust race realism, which ties into a more robust case for white nationalism inside the box. Now, of course, I say inside the box because there's outside the box, which is I care about my race qua my race. That's another argument that you can make. And it's an argument that is, it's compelling to a lot of people, but the problem is you can't go very far with that. You can't really prove that. You can't disprove it either, but you can't really prove it. You can't go to somebody and say, don't you care about your people? I guess what you can do is you can sort of say that don't feel so guilty about caring about your people, but really there's not a whole lot you can do with that. That's just what I wanted to say. I'm actually going off script here, which is why I'm sort of a bit more rambling. I go off script, in several places. In fact, you could probably tell where I go off script because it doesn't sound quite as scripted. So I actually had a conclusion written out here, but I actually read over the conclusion and kept talking, and so now I don't have a conclusion, and so I just need to conclude.